Okay, this is chapter 3, part 2. We left off last time talking about how there's a connection between various aspects of brain functioning and a propensity towards violent behavior. Related to sort of the wiring of the brain and the functioning of the brain is hormones as well. That's one thing that can affect um, your thinking, your emotions, your drives, aggression, that sort of thing is at least potentially are sex hormones. Specifically, the research is focused for the most part on testosterone. While the evidence is mixed and not strong, prenatal and circulating testosterone has been linked to violent crime. Dominant behaviors like beating opponents or handling guns tend to increase testosterone levels. So there's a couple of points there. The research does show that indeed there's a positive correlation between higher levels of um, testosterone in the blood and a tendency towards more aggression, towards violence. There's also research that shows that if you're when you're developing in the womb as a little embryo or fetus, that testosterone plays a very important part in the development of the brain and basically um, sort of lays down the tracks, if you will. It sort of designs the brain to be sensitive to testosterone when you're uh, grown up, or definitely when you're a teenager. Your testosterone levels surge, and this is true not just for males but for females too. Although the levels testosterone much higher for the males than the females. There's still females have testosterone as well, and that goes up a great deal during adolescence and stays high during adulthood, although not as high as when you're young. And this has, and then if you've been exposed to a lot of testosterone when you're a baby, when you're an embryo fetus, that you might be especially sensitive to testosterone, and a little bit might cause a strong reaction in a person. But one thing at a very basic level that testosterone could help explain is why you see such huge difference in violence between males and females. If we're talking specifically about serial killers, there we'll learn in later chapters that they're basically 90% male. Only about 10% of serial killers are female, and it's a similar number for mass murderers too. So testosterone could help explain this big gender difference in violence. And it could also help explain the difference in age when it comes to violence, too. We know that violence tends to be concentrated among young people, older teenagers. Violence gets more and more of a problem as you move through your adolescent years. And by the time you're a young adult, that's when serious violence tends to peak. And then once you hit your 30s and beyond 30 years of age, gradually, people become less and less prone to violence. At the extreme end, you don't see too many senior citizens committing murder, that sort of thing. It happens, but it's uncommon. And so this follows the track that we see with testosterone, that it peaks, it shoots up during adolescence, during puberty. It peaks among young adults, and then it gradually drifts down over the years. As you get older and older, the testosterone levels tend to fall. So that matches the age curve of crime, of violence, and also, as I said before, could help explain the gender difference in violence. So testosterone is definitely something that should be looked at more as playing a role in this. But it's complicated. This last sentence here, it's complicated because what you find is not only does testosterone make people a little more inclined to be aggressive or a little more hostile towards other people, um, but that there are things that influence testosterone levels. And so if you engage in competitive behavior like sports or definitely something a little more violent like boxing, something physical, but definitely just common sports, playing anything, football, basketball, tennis, you name it, that competitiveness tends to influence testosterone levels. If you win competitions, your testosterone tends to go up, and if you lose, your testosterone tends to go down. And the same thing with even simple things like handling guns or things that are of kind of associated with aggressiveness can tend to even something as simple as that can influence testosterone. You could have higher levels just being around things that um, suggest aggressiveness. And you don't have to play sports. You can watch sports and see the similar sorts of things. So it's not just that testosterone influences behavior. It could be that behavior could influence testosterone levels. And so it's a complicated relationship, and it's not at least the evidence we have so far, it's not as powerful as some people think. But I would say we still there's a lot to learn because it's difficult to study. It's a difficult thing to measure really accurately to be able to figure things out precisely. Now, this next study is interesting that administering testosterone to people makes them more risk-taking and more likely to interpret facial cues as hostility. And when we say administering testosterone, we're talking about giving subjects, research participants in a lab type study, giving them some testosterone and seeing how they react to it. And experimental research shows that they tend to become more willing to take risks, which we know is a trait, a characteristic that you tend to see in violent people, is that they're risk takers. Because violence is a very high risk sort of activity, because if you attack someone, you might not kill them, they might kill you. Because people don't like to get attacked, and they sometimes fight back. And even though you're the aggressor, you're the one that could end up being hurt or killed. Or you could definitely end up arrested and to go to prison for violence, because that's a serious crime, especially if it's homicide, and they usually catch you. So it's a high risk sort of behavior. And so it's not surprising that people who don't mind doing risky things are more likely to be violent. And not only are violent people tend to be risk takers, reckless risk takers, but also that they tend to interpret other people's actions as being hostile. These violent people tend to have a lot of hostility, meaning that they might just have an interaction with somebody, start a conversation with somebody, and the other person could be totally innocent and not mean anything by what they say, but a hostile person, will likely to take neutral or innocent comments and make a whole bunch out of them, like, what did you mean by that? Even though you might have said something perfectly innocent, a hostile person interprets that as, what are you trying to say about me, right? What do you really mean by that? I sense that you're insulting me, or that you're trying to put me down, or trying to, so hostile people are like that. They see bad intentions in other people, even if they're not there. And people who, from these testosterone studies, people who are given levels, the testosterone, increase their level of testosterone in their bodies, are more likely to look at a picture of a face that might be neutral in terms of the emotions of the face, and interpret that face as there being signs, cues that that person in the picture is hostile, is up to no good, is wanting to harm me in some way, poses a threat. So this is evidence that testosterone makes people more suspicious of others. And certainly the research shows that while men don't tend to, there's not really significant anger differences between men and women. Where men are different than women is they tend to be more suspicious, more hostile, and seeking revenge compared to females. So in some ways, you do see some of these gender differences that are related to violence and could be related to testosterone. Now, another line of research shows that giving sex offenders a combination of estrogen and progesterone, which are typically thought of as quote unquote female sex hormones, combining these therapies with cognitive behavioral therapy tends to reduce recidivism. So this is just another line of research that's something that's more sexual violence, sexual abuse. It has been shown to be that offenders are less likely to go back to their criminal behaviors, their sex offenses, with this combination of therapies where you're working on the biological side of it, the hormonal side of it, hormones driving sex drive, driving sexual related desires and behaviors, and combining that with cognitive behavioral therapy, which tends to focus on your attitudes and how you look at things. Maybe you got some bad attitudes when it comes to how you treat women or how you treat other people. That may feed into facilitate sex offenses. And so maybe we need to work on some of your views on things, your outlook, your attitudes, your perceptions. And if we can work on those in combination with uh, treating desires and more of the biological side of it, might be able to keep people from falling back into criminal behavior. Anyway, so again another area of research where I think we need a lot more. I'm not 100% convinced by it, but it's interesting and suggestive. And again, all of these are little pieces in the puzzle that could help us explain why people become extremely violent. Now, serotonin. Now we switch over away from hormones. All these that we talked about so far have been hormones, but we also have neurotransmitters found in the brain that are important in signaling brain activities. As signals move from one neuron to the next, these neurotransmitters carry those signals and connect neurons. And research has shown that these neurotransmitters are very important for a person's emotions. And we know that emotions are involved in violence. So serotonin is a widely studied neurotransmitter. And the research has shown that if you don't have the right kind of serotonin levels in your brain, that this has been linked to impulsive violence, to anger, irritability, and recidivism, meaning committing acts of violence again and again and again, repeat offenses, and suicide, even as well, even aggression towards yourself. So, and what it seems to happen is if your levels of serotonin are screwed up, then it tends to affect your emotions by making you irritable, depressed, angry, withdrawn, strong feelings, negative feelings, which feed into violence and even suicide. So there's clear research that transmitters make a huge difference. And again, this is getting specific about something going on in the brain that if it goes wrong, it can affect your emotions and it can affect your behavior. Low serotonin seems to lead to violence by disinhibiting people. So if you don't have enough serotonin as a neurotransmitter in your brain, that it may make you impulsive, that you don't think before you act. You lose control. Your emotions get the best of you. That's what they mean by disinhibited. You're not in control of yourself. Low serotonin works against developing strong self-control and social skills. So again, you get a person who's impulsive, out of control, spontaneous. And that sort of person is more likely to have a temper problem, to have an anger problem, to have a hostility problem, to act out violently before they even really realize what they're doing. It's, acting violent in a spontaneous way. Okay, low dopamine has been linked to aggression and antisocial tendencies. This shows that moderate levels of neurotransmitters are often the healthiest. That's what you find. A lot of times you don't want extremely high levels, extremely low levels. You want a nice, healthy, moderate level of these neurotransmitters, and it tends to regulate your emotions and produce more healthier, more pro-social behavior that's not where you're not breaking the law, not getting into trouble, not acting violently. Now, a couple other of these biochemicals in your body that affects things. This monoamine oxidase. This is activity this biochemical is active in the limbic system and frontal lobes and has been linked to aggression and criminality as well. Very high levels and very low levels seem to predict antisocial and psychopathic tendencies. And we'll talk about being a psychopathic tendencies later. But again, you see here that it's nice, healthy, moderate levels that we seem to want people to have. If they're too high or they're too low, it causes dysfunction. It throws off your brain functioning and can affect your perceptions, your emotions, and how you handle problems. And you may not handle them as well and you may be more likely to fall into unacceptable antisocial behavior, aggression, and violence because you're not able to handle yourself well because your emotions and perceptions are all out of whack. So this is, again, all of these lines of research they're very complicated, sophisticated, and difficult to tease out exactly what's going on. So we still have a lot of work to do in these areas. The A-type gene that regulates the MAO levels interacts with experiencing child abuse to predict violent crime. So here we see a combination of things that I think will help us explain serial killers. A combination of things. Here you have a particular type of version of a gene. There's a lot of genes that humans have that vary from one person to another. There's different versions of the gene. The gene basically does the same thing, but it's a slightly different version. They call these different versions alleles. And so this A-type gene is one version, one allele that this person might have that person doesn't have, because it varies from person to person to person. So a person who's got this A-type variation of this gene, that's a gene that's responsible for regulating how much of this monoamine oxidase, this MAO, you have in your system. The gene regulates that. It controls how much of this you have, and we know that if it's too high or too low, it's a problem. So if you've got somebody who's got a particular gene, and unfortunately, they also find themselves growing up in an abusive home where the victims of child abuse, what research has shown is that that combination of, we're talking about a gene that affects the brain, affects neurotransmitters in the brain. If that is combined with the traumatic negative experiences of child abuse when you're growing up, that sort of individual has a lot higher risk of acting violently as a teenager or a grown-up compared to someone who doesn't have that gene, that version of the gene, and someone who was not a victim of child abuse. See, so here it's a combination of things that are working together. Genetic level, brain level, environmental level, what your upbringing is like. Are you treated well as a child or not? So this shows the complexity of human behavior, but it's really necessary, I think, to explain serial killer behavior because, as I said in an earlier segment, these are rare criminals, and so since they're rare, that implies that they have a rare combination of qualities, of traits that can contribute altogether to produce a rare form of extreme violence. CNS functioning, that means central nervous system. So here we're talking basically about the brain, the functioning of the central nervous system. EEGs or electroencephalograms show that chronic offenders have brain waves that are lower on average and abnormal. Offenders show more delta, which is a slow sort of brainwave pattern. So it's sort of repeating here with a little bit different kind of study what we were talking about earlier, that you do see this pretty consistent pattern among offenders, among violent individuals that have this unusual pattern of brain waves, that they tend to be slower and they tend to be abnormal, that they're unusual. They're not, when we say abnormal, I mean this, they look different, these brain waves look different when they're read by this EEG. They look different than the law-abiding population. And so that indicates that the brain is in some way functioning differently and makes one prone to violence and crime. And as I talked about earlier, I don't want to cover it again, but recall the theory that people put forward to try to explain this, that individuals who are violent tend to have brain wiring, which is set at a low level, which makes a person tend to crave extreme experiences, extreme stimulation, which violence and crime is certainly that. Okay, autonomic nervous system. So here we're talking more about the nerves throughout your body, right? Not so much a focus on the brain, but you have nerves throughout your entire body. So they're focusing more on this part of the nervous system here and the functioning there. Offenders tend to have low average heart rates and skin conductance, and these suggest less anxiety and slower learning than among the law-abiding. Same kind of idea as what we saw with these brain studies, that this is one of the clearest and most consistent, and if you've never heard this before, maybe kind of odd findings in the research, is that criminals, violent people, tend to have a slower heartbeat, a lower average heartbeat than peaceful people, than law-abiding people. And also with these skin conductance tests, those basically measure for slight changes in sweat on your hands, like your palms. And that's an indication, sweat is an indication of nervousness, anxiety. And so criminals, violent people tend to have less less skin conductance, less anxiety, less nervousness in experiments. So it all kind of converges together, this idea that that criminals tend to be sort of underreact to dangers and threats. What would make you and I overwhelmed in terms of being threatening, dangerous, that someone who has this kind of slower brain wiring is not scared, is not aroused, is not freaked out by scary sorts of things. And so they stay calm. They don't get nervous. They don't get anxious. Their heart rate stays low as if they're calm. So this is actually something that is consistent with the view of of a psychopath who doesn't feel emotions. If someone's being harmed or tortured, most of us would really be affected by that on an emotional level. But the idea is that a psychopath doesn't really feel the pain of others, the suffering of others. They're disconnected from that. They're insensitive to the suffering of other people. And it might have something to do, even at this brain level, that they're wired in a way where they don't get worked up by, highly emotional, threatening, dangerous sorts of things like the rest of people do, like law-abiding people do. And this especially this heartbeat thing is very clear in the research. It's very consistent. So there's definitely something going on here with this nervous system functioning. Let's see. I'm getting kind of long here. Let's stop and we'll pick it up in the next segment.